That's it. The shitbox rally car has been sold and going to its new home. Bit sad actually. It's an absolute weapon, that car. Wish I could keep it, but got to move them on. These guys will enjoy it. Young blokes from Castlemaine. Have a look at them. G'day, welcome to part 2 of the quarantine special, breaking down the suspension front and rear on the WB H Series ute. Where we left off last time, we dismantled the leaf springs in the rear, removed the diff, so the diffs are sitting there. Then we removed part of the front suspension, the sway bar, and those that are linked together, removed the brake calipers and things like that. So today, after, if you remember, if you haven't seen the first episode with part 1, I suggest you go and click the link up above and watch that episode. And then come and watch this one, because the two, if you're in a similar situation, you'll probably want to look through the whole thing and see your options as well. But yeah, so as you know, if you'd watched part 1, you saw the dilemma with the springs. So I'm going to tackle that today, and we'll go from there. I've got a couple of tools to use and talk you through, and get these springs out, and we'll get the job done. So anyway, I'll see you on the other side, and we'll get into it. Alright, so moving on from last week, when we got stuck at the front springs, I needed a spring compressor, as you remember. Now, I've done a bit of research over the last week, as I usually do, to try and get the right decision, because I know, you know, it's sort of, well, when you start something like this, you've taken a little bit of responsibility of guiding people that are doing a similar thing down the right path. So I don't want to hurt myself, so I want to do it the correct way. Turns out there's a couple of different ways you can do it, and I also learned from trial and error, and cost me a little bit of money along the way. So I will talk you through what I went through, and then you can either decide to use it on your project or just not. I mean, once again, this is just what I'm doing, and I'm documenting what I'm doing on this build. So anyway, spring compressors, I've found out that there's 2 different types of spring compressor. There's one that is a external spring compressor, and basically they clamp on the outside of the spring, and then you can wind them in each side. There's usually 2. You wind them in at an even rate, and it compresses the spring enough to when you can actually dislodge the lower control arm and then swing it out, and that way you can remove the bolt on the ball joint and swing that out. So without compressing the spring, there's a lot of tension pushing down on that ball joint. And obviously, if you remove the ball joint and try and dislodge it, it'll push down. So that can be dangerous, can lead to injuries, and that's what we don't want. So you can get the spring compressors usually for most cars. However, on these H series, I think it's called a AA front end. Exactly the same style of front end that you'd find on Chevs overseas and things like that. Obviously GM made and obviously designed these as well, so you know, they've taken a lot from the American guys, American cars, and applied them to these. So essentially it's the same front end that you would find on a lot of GM vehicles over in the States as well. So there is a few references online to find out how to remove them. So basically, when you've got a upper and lower control arm and the springs encased in the centre, you don't have access to put these springs on. So you would have seen these if you guys have been into cars for a while. These are heavy duty ones, so they're designed for the weight of a V8 spring, which is obviously a harder spring tension than a 6-cylinder would be, due to the weight of the engine. So this is what they look like. And basically, they've got an upper and a lower hook. It's pretty self-explanatory. You put it on the upper and the lower part of the spring each side, and then you wind this nut with a socket wrench, and yeah, compress them up until the spring is at such a height that it dislodges from the upper and lower control arm, and you get it out. Obviously you have to remove the gas shock first in the middle in order to do that. These will not fit on a H series AA upper and lower control arm front end. So you need an internal spring compressor, and this is where I went wrong. So $70 down the drain. Oh, no, that's actually $45 down the drain. But you never know. It's good to have in the kit anyway, so I'll keep them. But that was a mistake by not doing my research first. It cost me $45. I've then since done a bit more research, and they've come up with the actual tool that you want to use is a proper GM tool designed for the H series chassis and front end. But some geezer's got it on eBay for like $500, which is crazy. So I can't imagine why the amount of utes and cars that they made in Australia for these Holdens, and you just can't find one of these internal spring compressors for under $500. It's just ridiculous. So anyway, there's a couple other options out there for internal spring compressors, and this is one that I found that's designed for GM front ends, and it is like this. So basically you put it down the middle of where the shock goes, take the shock out, put this down the middle of that where the shock usually sits, and then there's a special plate like there which you can see is adjustable depending on your spring size, that will go down and sit underneath the spring, and these two clamps will sit on top of the spring. Anyway, I think that's the way it goes. I'm yet to use it, and so this could change when I start getting into it, but essentially what you do then, once that's seated inside the spring, you start to wind up that bolt there. So it may go like that actually. So anyway, and you'll wind this nut and it'll bring that up, compress the spring from internally, and then you'll be right to remove it. So that's what I'm going to give a go. There is another way of doing it. So while you're doing this, you have to position a jack underneath the lower control arm if the spring did let go or something like that, so it doesn't go poof. So there is a way of doing it without the internal spring compressor, just using that jack underneath the lower control arm, giving the ball joint a bit of a hit, dislodging it, and then lowering it down that way. But I just thought I'd play it safe and get the spring compressor and go from there. So anyway, enough crapping on. You know, we just got to basically get into it now and give it a go. And so I'll start with the left-hand passenger side, start going through a few things, getting ready for the spring compressor to be seated, and then we'll go from there and see how it goes. All right, so first thing we've got to do is remove this top nut for the shocker and the bottom two nuts for the shocker. Get that out first, so we'll do that. All right, so that's done, remove that. So anyway, the sizes for the bottom nut, sizes for the top nut, 17mm, bottom two nuts, 13mm. Just socket, easily undone. With the top one on the shocker, there's probably C's that this will tend to move around. So I just got a pin bar and just put it through the top upper control arm and just pushed against that. There's probably another way to do it. I'm not going to use these. I wasn't too concerned about marking this, but if you wanted to reuse your shocks, I wouldn't advise that method. I don't know any other way of doing that, but that just stopped that rotating and allowed me to do that nut. As you can see, this is stuffed, absolutely stuffed. These will probably be, I reckon these will be original. I don't think they've ever been changed. It says Australia on it, so nothing else is made in Australia anymore. So yeah, they must be originals. Now that that's out, and tell you what, you sort of get nervous when you don't know what you're doing. I'm expecting this thing to fucking explode at any moment with the spring load, but that's just in your mind. I think it certainly is a risk, but you have to minimise it. Certainly taking the shock off is not a risk. It's not under load, so the deeper you get into it, the more dangerous, it's so to speak dangerous. As long as you take precaution, I think it should be fine. So anyway, moving on to the next stage, which will be loosening. I'll take the camera down and give you a proper look. The lower control arm bolt is there on both sides. You just have to loosen them off, so that'll allow the lower control arm to swing down once the spring is compressed, and it won't be seized and stay there. So That's important. Also, during this stage, you want to loosen the ball joint, upper and lower ball joint nuts, but you only want to loosen them one turn, just enough to basically free up those ball joints. So once you've cracked the nuts on those two, you'll have to remove this little piece of wire. Once you've done that, hit it with a sizable hammer and right on these points here, the upper and the lower ball joint, and that will pop the ball joint and dislodge it from the nut. So that's the theory. I'm going to give it a go, see how it goes. Alright, so a little bit happened after I hit those ball joints on the spindle. Neil popped over, and I embarked on, so as you can see, the spring is removed, there's the lower control arm out, and the spindle and the disc brakes over there. So got it out, this tool did the job. I'll put a link up to grab this tool because it's the cheapest one you're going to get to do this job. It's about 70 bucks, 75 bucks. It's off eBay, but there is a company associated with it that you could buy direct if you wanted to. So, great tool. I'll go through. So basically what I want to do, Neil's showing me the ropes of how to do this correctly with this tool. I'll start again on the driver's side, talk you through the whole process, and fingers crossed it comes out as easy as the other one. Okay, so the shock absorber has been removed from inside the spring. I have removed the lock pins from those two upper and lower ball joints and done a turn on each of the nuts. That's a bigger nut than the lower ball joint nut is bigger than the top. That's 19, that's 22. So they've been loosened off. Be very careful not to take them all the way off when you do it. So now I'll show you the process of fitting this unit into the spring. So at the start I didn't think it was going to be possible, and then Neil came along and we figured it out. So that's the compression spring that was the second one that I bought. So the only thing I needed to do when I first initially tried to get this through, you can see it's too thick, it doesn't fit. And these are actually welded in, these things, so you can't take them off. So I thought it was over, but then when you actually had a look at it in a little bit greater detail, there's actually a little sleeve inside. Yeah, a little sleeve that's seated inside upper control arm area, and that's obviously to house where the shock absorber comes in. So, and if you have a look, you knock that out. Now your hole's big enough. So yeah, there was a little, on this unit, there's a little clip that sits in there, but I have to remove that because that doesn't allow it to fit through this hole. It's just a little bit too big. So you remove that clip and then you can feed that through down the spring, and then you'll put your little claw arm in the middle, 3-thread it, make sure it's seated in the thing. So once you've done that, you'll be ready to go. This thing here is meant to an alignment plate to get your seating right in your spring, but I don't know how it really works, so we didn't use that in the last one. All right, so now I will push that down, get the claw inside the spring, and then we can start to precariously wind it up and get the compression out of this spring. So here we go. Okay, so I can see why there's warnings with doing this, because there's an extreme amount of tension on that spring through this contraption. So it's a bloody good contraption though. It's really easy to use. I've tightened that to the point where you can see the spring has lifted off the lower control arm by about 1 centimetre, and the ball joints are now loose. So that's right to, I've got the jack under there anyway, but that's right to now take the nuts off those upper and lower ball joints, and then use a jimmy bar, pin bar, to then pry them off, and then take this stub axle with the disc off, and that will come off and then allow the lower control arm to then swing down. Once the lower control arm is completely removed, you'll have to take the bolts out so you can take the thing out. Then you can decompress the spring, wind it back, let it get to the point where it just falls out the bottom, and then you're done. So I will now attempt to get these ball joints off, remove the stub axle and the disc, and then that'll give me access to then lower this control arm, and then we're almost done. So fingers crossed, here we go. All right, success. That's come out. We're not out of the woods yet. That spring is still bound and loaded. So the next, so you can see the disc is over there. The upper ball joint came out smoothly. The second one needed a few hits of the hammer, and then it just loosened. I've cracked a bit of dirt and rust around that area. So now the lower control arm will come out. And it's best to take it out before you decompress the springs. So I'm going to take those two bolts that I cracked earlier. You can see that the sway bars are in the way, but you can get access to it and pull these out, and then that lower control arm will literally pull out forwards and clear this so you don't have to remove it. So almost there. So remove those bolts, get the lower control arm out of there, and then we can decompress this spring. So far that's all gone pretty smoothly. You can see the lower control arm is now out. You can see the ball joint, lower ball joint there is out. So that's all ready for cleaning and prepping for paint. And now the last precarious part is remaining. So that's to detension this spring, which is completely fully loaded at the moment. So I've got a 9mm socket here, and I'm just backing it off. For those that have done it a million times, it probably, you know, you're not cautious at all, but for me, this is pretty precarious stuff, because you just don't know if it's going to go pop or something's going to give. So I'm not standing directly over that bolt, just in case something pops. But the last one, there's enough thread. You've also got to watch out, there's enough thread. You don't want it to still be under tension when the thread at the base runs out. So that's why it's important to get an internal compressing spring, internal spring compressor that has a long enough throw in the thread that it will be long enough for your spring compression, so that you don't undo it and the thread ends, and then you've still got a lot of compression in the spring and it'll just explode. So from memory, these are 350 mil. It's got a 350 mil thread length on it, so just as the thread ends, the spring just drops out of there. And that's it. So you can see, spring just fell out on its own accord. You can see the clamp inside did its job. That's what I was talking about, the thread. And then that comes out the bottom. So go and buy one of these tools. Well worth 70 bucks. And that's it. All right, so now that the lower control arm and the springs are off, it's time for the upper control arms to be disassembled. These come with its own things to be mindful of. Essentially, you've got to loosen these two side bolts. Loosen these two as well. Now, these little tabs in here are very important because that's how you get your wheel alignment. So you got to mark these and make sure they go on exactly the same way that you took them off. So make sure that this stays with the passenger side, and this will be the passenger side right hand side, passenger side left. Just make sure you mark it, put it in a container, and when it comes to reassembly, put them in the same spot again so you don't have to stuff up your wheel alignment. Also, someone else mentioned this on a previous video that I did, and they were concerned with these bolts. So originally on factory, this upper ball joint cradle or seat, I don't know what you'd call it, used to be riveted in factory. So this is riveted on, and in order to get it off, if you need to change these, you needed to grind these rivets off, and you can see where someone's ground these off before they've hit the upper control arm. It's a bit messy, but that's just the way it was done. So as a replacement to the pop rivets, instead of pop riveting it, GM or Holden obviously came up with this plate that was bolted on with these bolts as a replacement for the factory rivet, and it's a perfectly safe addition to the upper control arm, and that's just the way it was done. So that's two answers to your question on that one. All right, so I'm just going to remove these bolts, get the upper control arm out, lay it all out, and we'll go over exactly what we need to start cleaning. Okay, so that's it. Front end's disassembled. We're now off without a hitch. Really happy with that internal spring compressor. Great compressor for the money, and did the job perfectly. So as you can see, everything's off. I just removed those upper control arms with the alignment spacers and made sure I labelled them. What I could see, those bolts staying there. I've still got to grind this star picket off, which was obviously a bracket. We've spoken about that before. But yeah, so really everything else is just brake lines and hydraulic hoses and things like that, which, you know, I'll probably just leave on. So now, which is the exciting part, I'm going to be moving on to just cleaning and prepping this for paint and get the thing sorted so we can move on to bodywork and things like that. So, one other thing, there's little bump stops that sit just under the upper control arm. Look like that. So, I mean, it's not too bad, but it's pretty perish, so I'm going to replace them as well. You can just pop them off from putting a screwdriver underneath and just popping them off. So I'll put some footage up now. So essentially what you see now laying on the floor in both left and right is the front end assembly. So yeah, you've got the springs, upper, lower control arm with the ball joints still seated inside them. You've got the disc front disc brakes with the stub axles still mounted inside. Behind that, you've got the calipers with the hydraulic brake lines still on. You have the sway bar, and I always get confused about the other parts that are attached to that, but I explained that in part one. So everything is sitting there. As I mentioned in part one, I'm not going to go and disassemble and knock out all the ball joints and caster arms and take all the bushes off. I'll still weigh it up, but I don't think I will go down that path because, as I mentioned, I got a fair bit of work done on this thing before I took it apart. It's about 800 bucks worth of work on the front, and a lot of that was replaced, so it's pretty much new. So it really just needs a lick of paint, clean up, and reassembly. So I'm going to be happy with that. I need to purchase the lower stub axles with a 50mm drop on them from the rod shop, Castlemane Rod Shop. From memory, they're about $499, say 500 bucks, which is a reasonably big outlay for this this build on something that's only going to be 50mm, but they make the world of difference. You sustain that comfortable ride, but you get it really nicely seated in the front end without compromising the quality. So I think it's worth it. As far as tyres go and wheels, I've been umming and ahhing about which size to go. Initially I was going to go 17s, But there's something to be said about the old school 15s and 16s or 15s because you know, these tyres, a lot of tyre looks good on these cars. So, but I do love the Canterbury GTS Sprint wheels in the smoked grey chrome, I think it is. They bloody look good. So I'm thinking I'll probably go down that path. So that won't be a cheap investment either, but wheels maketh the car, I reckon. So you've got to get the right wheels and the right suspension, and then your car will sit nicely and everything else rides off that, I think. If you've got a good cracking paint job but shit wheels and suspension, then you're doing yourself an injustice. As someone mentioned, it's like taking a hot girl back to your room and making her a cup of tea. That's going to be it for this episode. I'm going to keep it short and sweet. Part 3 will be cleaning up this chassis and start prepping it for paint, and also introducing the internal product that I've got for the internals of this chassis. Thanks again for watching this episode. If you've just joined recently, think about subscribing and watching the whole series. You might get something out of it and inspire you to start your own project. So thanks guys, see you next time.